Well, Justin Trudeau. We know he's made a habit lately, at least during his 8 years as Prime Minister, of blaming others for every single skip and fault that he's had in his career, if you can call it that. But now you're never going to guess who he is throwing under the bus. Let's get into it.
Oh, yeah!
What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to The Fringe. We've covered a lot of Justin Trudeau's guffaws and follies on this channel. We even had some great videos over the weekend and last week into how I think it's over for him, how it's done. And again, people have said it's over, and often people in the comments say, why do people keep saying it's over? It's not over. This is the beginning of the end for Justin Trudeau. Things are unraveling very quickly. We can see that with last week's vote into transparency and documents to be legally required to come out in terms of what money was paid to contractors, promotions, every red cent of taxpayer money to not only be displayed and put on view for the whole world to see, but also, I guess you could say the government is to recoup those costs for Canadians. So some of our money might come back to us at some point in time, and it's only going to be a drop in the bucket in comparison to what Justin Trudeau has done to this country in terms of padding friends' pockets, giving kickbacks, and screwing over the common Canadian in terms of their home values, the cost of living, and their futures, their children's futures. Now, Pierre Poilievre over the weekend has come out to call BS on Justin Trudeau and talk a little bit about what it is that Justin Trudeau is now skipping out on and hiding in terms of the overinflated prices of housing in our housing market this weekend, or the housing market in general, sorry, over the weekend. And I kind of wanted to showcase this because he makes some great points, but you're never going to guess who Justin Trudeau is now blaming. We've heard him blame Jody Wilson-Raybould. We've heard him blame Marco Mendicino. We've heard him blame Anthony Rota for bringing a Nazi into the House of Commons. Well, now, and this is rich, we've heard him blame Stephen Harper. We know he loves to blame Stephen Harper. And this is where I'm saying that it's over for Justin Trudeau because he has nobody left to blame. If you watched Saturday's video, I showed just how Justin Trudeau is now saying that the documents that came out last week about Trudeau's involvement with Winnipeg lab leaks and Chinese spies came out with his quotes all over them and paperwork, and including proof of him blocking documents from surfacing and suing speakers over trying to make them public, while people still continue to insist, hey, Justin Trudeau's not in charge of that stuff. He's just the Prime Minister of Canada. Well, simple little harder, ladies and gentlemen, because that's Justin Trudeau left with no one to throw under the bus. And I guess in his desperation, well, he's got one more person left, and this is going to be classic. Now, I will be chiming in from time to time in this video. Again, I want to make sure all points are gathered. But Pierre Poilievre doing another little mini documentary of a show, and I really like what he does in this because it explains a lot about the current situation of housing in this country. And again, I'll cut in with my bits, but let's get the show started, ladies and gents.
You'll never believe who he's blaming this time. But before I break it to you, it's not a surprise Trudeau is grasping to blame anyone and everyone. After all, since he promised affordable homes, Canada's housing costs have doubled. They've outpaced incomes faster in Canada than in any other G7 country, now costing 25 to 45% more than south of the border. Demographia says that Vancouver is the third most overpriced housing market in the world, and you can now buy a 20-bedroom castle in Scotland for less than a 2-bedroom in Kitchener. So blame anyone and everyone to get the heat off Trudeau, right? But you'll never believe who he's blamed this time. Not Stephen Harper, but Jean Chrétien. Yes, that Jean Chrétien, the former Liberal Prime Minister. Here's what Trudeau's housing minister said.
And I should, to be fair, point to the cuts that were made in the early 90s under a Liberal government that actually discontinued investment in affordable housing for low-income Canadians.
Now, it is true that in 1995, the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien cancelled a lot of housing programs to save money and fight the debt crisis left behind by Pierre Trudeau. So can we blame the Chrétien government from the mid-90s for doubling housing costs over the last 8 years? Well, let's
Okay, so I'm going to stop for a second because this is where it gets laughable. Justin Trudeau Now, I was no fan of Jean Chrétien. You think back to things like the sponsorship scandal, and Jean Chrétien did a lot of shady things. But the thing about government, and it's the same thing I've said about business, the same thing I was always told in business school, and that was there's never anything you can do 100% of the time to please people, and the person who tries to is a fool. Now, that works with any government. And I keep saying that even if somebody like Pierre Poilievre becomes Prime Minister of Canada, there's going to be decisions he makes that are going to make people upset. There's going to be decisions he comes out with policies or plans that even his biggest supporters are sometimes going to question. And that's the way politics work. So while Chrétien did eliminate some things throughout his career, he at least had a better track record than Justin Trudeau. And of course, Justin Trudeau now taking time out of his day to not only say, well, I've kind of beat the dead horse when it comes to Stephen Harper. So I'm going to blame a prime minister who was around in the early 90s to explain why housing in 2024 is absolutely absurd. I'm going to let Pierre get back into it, but it just gets crazier, folks.
Check out the data. Here's the RBC Housing Affordability Chart, which measures home ownership costs as a percentage of median household income. Simply put, it's the share of the average family's pre-tax paycheck needed to make monthly payments on the average home. If indeed Jean Chrétien's cuts to these federal housing programs really are to blame for today's problems, you'd expect the graph to look like this, with a sudden rise in housing costs right when the cuts took place, or at least like this, with a gradual worsening of affordability starting right after the cuts. But the graph shows no such thing. Here's what the graph actually looks like. Instead, housing affordability actually improved after Chrétien's spending cuts and then remained stable for 13 years before a brief jump towards the beginning of the U.S. housing crisis, and then...
Sorry, folks. I thought this was a good time to jump in. So when you look at this graph, and Pierre's doing a great job of explaining, I'm certainly not trying to say he's left anything out, but this should show you, again, the validity of Justin Trudeau's claims. Now, we all know that, of course, what he says isn't true. Of course, he's grasping at straws. But this just shows you how stupid he thinks the actual Canadian is to believe that something that happened over here in 1994 caused this rift that right around the pandemic era has shot up. Now, during the pandemic, you look at spending, you look at debt, you look at CERB, you look at all this money printed, and overinflation of goods and carbon taxes, and Pierre's going to get into it better than me, but what it does is this graph in its own invalidates Justin Trudeau's claim and shows just how desperate he is throwing people under the bus.
Again, housing costs moderated back to their long-term average by 2015, a full 20 years after Chrétien canceled these programs. Now, here in the chart, you see the time when I was housing minister, when it took about 38% of the average family's paycheck to make payments on the average home. Now enter Justin Trudeau.
We need real change in affordable housing.
He promised to bring back the federal housing programs that Jean Chrétien had canceled.
The federal government is not only back in housing, but we're here to stay.
And he did. The Trudeau government brought back in $89 billion of so-called affordable housing programs in Ottawa. Now, you'd expect if these programs were effective that there would be a drop in housing costs after the spending began. So what are the results of all this spending? Well, housing costs shot up. In fact, they've become less affordable than in the entire recorded history of the Royal Bank's measure. Never before has the average Canadian family had to spend 62% of their monthly pre-tax income just to make monthly payments on the average home. And that's why, after 8 years of Trudeau, roughly 26% of Canadians are the only ones who can afford a single-family home.
Now, I wanted to get into this because this is where I find it gets really important, and this is where there's comparabilities to what Pierre's talking about. When you look at 30% of your income to 62, that's double. During Justin Trudeau's years, in order to be able to just afford the ability to buy a home or the ability to pay for the home that you live in. We've covered stories in the past where you can see that the average I think the article was from 2022, so 2 years ago, where it was saying that the average Canadian can't even afford a $500 emergency to come up in their monthly budget, meaning a car repair, kids needing glasses, medical bills, anything along those lines, a sick animal. If there was a $500 necessity that was required all of a sudden, whether, a repair in the house, whatever you want to have it, you guys get my gist, that the average Canadian can't afford that. And again, that was 2 years ago. I have friends of mine who combined make around $130,000 a year income. They both have very substantial jobs, I would say. They both work for offices. They're not in retail. And $130,000 a year. Now, if you would have given those people the same living situation, same wage 15 years ago, so 2010, those people would be able to afford their home. They'd be able to afford 2 vehicles. They'd be able to afford to possibly go on vacation once a year, probably to somewhere nice, like go down. Well, I'm going to say something nice, and someone's going to say, that place is a toilet. But if you say something like Puerto Vallarta, or if you say people could go to Cancun for a vacation or any kind of trip, somebody would be able to afford those things on $130,000 a year. The friends of mine that are making $130,000 a year right now that just re-signed their mortgage have told me that they're basically living check to check, that by the time they pay for their kids' after school programs, so like sports, when they pay for their vehicle insurance, their cell phones, their groceries, which have skyrocketed, their skyrocketed utility bills, their property tax, all the fees they have to pay. By the time it's all said and done, ladies and gentlemen, they've said that they are now in that bubble where if they were to come in contact with an emergency situation, such as, again, anything I listed earlier, a repair at home, broken down vehicle, they'd have to go into credit, or they'd have to dip into a line of credit in order to secure the safety of their home continuing to run, just because of the way Justin Trudeau has raised the cost of living. And this is all post-pandemic. A lot of this came around COVID. And I hear that because my wife and I bought our first home in 2015, just as Justin Trudeau was coming into office. And again, we panicked to buy our home because we'd been saving for a few years. The cost of housing was going up in Calgary a little bit at that time. And again, rumor was coming around that Justin Trudeau was going to be the next Prime Minister of Canada. And that made us a little nervous because of oil and gas and where my wife made her living. And I'll tell you, I'm really glad we jumped in when we did, because I can't even imagine how difficult it would be to do that today. But let's continue.
So when Trudeau ministers blame a decision from 30 years ago for a problem that only began in 2015, I call BS. Now, this is important because if we accept the falsehood that ending federal housing programs caused the problem, we might be tricked into thinking that bringing them back is the solution. It is not, as proven by the fact that housing affordability improved when the programs were eliminated and worsened at the fastest pace ever when the Trudeau government brought them back. Why? Because these programs build bureaucracy and not homes. So now you must pay more to buy or rent, and you must pay more on your taxes for housing programs that only make the problem worse.
Pierre talks about that. Again, I wanted to interject because I often see these posts from people, and I'm sure you folks see them online too, or have heard of people that say, I tried to save up for a home and I have a down payment, but the bank is telling me I can't afford a $2,000 a month mortgage, but I'm paying $3,000 in rent. There lies the problem, is that it's not just about supply and demand. It's that the banks have gate-kept people who have good, honest jobs from being able to move out of the rental space and into home ownership. We've seen, again, with the way Trudeau has ravaged the economy, that people now have to go through unfathomable stress tests in order to just be able to purchase a home, which would actually save them from what they're currently spending, which is just ridiculous.
It's bad to fail. It's even worse to fail expensively. You see, we don't need scapegoats or excuses or more government programs. We need my common sense plan that builds homes, not bureaucracy. It requires municipalities permit 15% more homes per year as a condition of getting federal money. It sells off 6,000 federal buildings for housing and speeds up CMHC's approval of housing finance to 2 months and not 2 years. More homes, less bureaucracy. More common sense, less BS. Let's bring it home.
And the usual campaign, I'm just going to say campaign word salad from Pierre, because we've heard all that a million times over. But what he talked about there was no more excuses. And that's, again, what we're getting from Justin Trudeau is a big bag of excuses and word salad. Now, what Pierre is talking about does make sense, because some people tried to correct me last week when I talked about the way housing went in the early 2000s in Calgary, that the average home was probably around $250,000. Now, I'll again reiterate that story in the Cliff Notes version. My father had a neighbor in the early 2000s that had been trying for about 6 months to sell his house at about $260,000. He couldn't get an offer on it. And for about 3 or 4 months. Now, all of a sudden, there was a material shortage in Calgary, and homes weren't being built. We had people moving to Calgary from places like Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, because Calgary was in a boom phase, and people came from places where houses were almost double the cost of what Calgary was sitting at the time, if not more. So those people were sitting outside of homes, making bids on houses. My father's neighbor came out one day, and we were sitting outside, and he put a new for sale sign up on his lawn. He'd hired a new agent and said that this agent had told him to put his house on the market for $325,000 from the $260,000. And my father was flabbergasted and said, "How does that happen? I don't understand." He says, "Well, he's told me if he doesn't sell it by the end of the weekend, he'll give me the list price and buy the house himself." Now, we sat there that weekend and watched as the realtor went outside from vehicle to vehicle, sight unseen, taking bids from people. And that's when we were told by a friend of ours that worked in construction, this is a material shortage, so there's no homes available. So we go back to the old terms of supply and demand. Now, that's important, because what happened then was I said to my father, well, if houses are going to be $400,000, because that's about what they shot up to after that, I said, there's no way my wife and I could afford a home based on the wages we were making in the early 2000s. Well, my father told me, relax, it's okay. As soon as the materials come back, they'll start building houses again, and the cost will level out. You'll see it maybe not drop to what it used to be, but it'll come down and stabilize. And he's basing that off of a long term of watching markets. Now, materials came back into Calgary, and houses kind of hung around the $400,000 mark, maybe around $375,000 to $400,000 in the early 2000s. I'm talking around 2006. And the reason for that was home builders like the one I used to work for at the time started saying things, or at least the rumblings around the office were, if those houses are worth that much, our houses are worth that much. And people, again, this is where I was corrected, where people said, so supply and demand has nothing to do with that. Well, it does, but how they got around that was what Pierre Poilievre talks about all the time with government red tape. So home builders stopped building as many homes, at least as fast or as quickly, so that there was no supply. You would purchase a newly built home, but you would have to buy it about 6 to 8 months out at the time, get your down payment in, and wait for the home to be built. So by doing that, they could keep the price, the inflated price up, and the values up in Calgary, while people, again, were coming from expensive cities, raising the cost of living. We've seen it happen even in cities like Winnipeg, where the average home used to be in the mid 200s. Nowadays, I go back to visit, and houses are $600,000, $650,000. Again, supply and demand. So what Pierre Poilievre is talking about, I know it's a long rant, ladies and gentlemen, but I'm trying to make sense of all of it for you. If you're younger, at least, and don't understand the housing market, that essentially what Pierre Poilievre is saying is they're going to give bonuses to builders for producing within an allotted time frame. And if they produce faster and up to code, then they're going to get a bonus themselves on top of what Pierre's already promising them. Now, that is motivation to work. That's motivation to get the job done properly and quickly. By creating more supply, even with increased demand, if there's too much supply, that should right things, and that should allow people to have the affordability factor in order to buy and purchase a home. We'll see if that comes to pass. But to me, it's one of the only ways I can see to fix this issue, especially in places like Toronto, where you're hearing that people have to save 25 years in order to just script together a down payment for a home. That's absolutely ridiculous. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments, especially about Justin blaming John Chrétien. Let me know what you guys think down below. Do you think this is going to work? Do you think Pierre's got the answer to this problem? Do you have a better solution to the problem? I'm always interested to hear what you guys have to say. If it's your first time here, I hope this video has earned your subscription. Make sure as you're hitting that button, double check that you're still subscribed, because YouTube has had a habit of unsubscribing people at random. I hear about it in the comments all the time, so make sure you're still subscribed if you already were. Turn on your bell for notifications, and join us here on the channel. Usually every Friday we do a live stream. This Friday, however, I will be out of town. Speaking of Winnipeg, I'm going back to visit some friends and family, so I'll be gone out of town on Friday. However, I will do a makeup stream this Sunday night at 6 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Central, where we'll go over everything that happened this week, everything coming up in the week ahead, and I look forward to seeing each and every one of you there. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day and enjoyed this video. I'll catch you on the next one.